for this second in a series of talks relating to the exhibition upstairs, which is a display of early photographs of Indian monuments. And I'm joined, as last week, by the curator of the exhibition, Dr. Sudeshna Guha. My name is Giles Tillotson. I'm responsible for the exhibition program, of which it's a part. So last week, we focused on the relationship between photography and the early field surveys of Indian architecture, Indian monuments, in order to talk about how these photographs form part of this colonial enterprise of knowledge, formation, and control, but pointing out that the exhibition, rather interestingly, shows how there's a kind of nationalist turn towards the end of the period that we cover, 1855 to 1920, when you start getting Indian photographers giving a response to the colonial narrative that the photographs are setting up. This evening, our focus is rather different. We're going to focus instead on the picturesque element of some of these works. So it doesn't cover all of the photographs by any means, but an important group of them. And the format here is, I'm going to start off by talking a bit about the picturesque as an aesthetic within English art, leading into photography. And then when we get to the particular examples and what this means on the ground in terms of photographing Indian monuments, Sudeshna is going to join in or take over with her own narratives. But I wanted to start by talking about the picturesque itself, because the word is nowadays used so loosely that it almost has no meaning at all. Picturesque doesn't actually mean anything in common parlance much more than pretty. Pretty as a picture. And so this obscures the fact that in 18th and 19th century English aesthetics, it had a very specific meaning. And I want to start by telling you what that is. Not, I should say, up front, because, you know, in some kind of pedantic academic fashion, I want to police how you use the word. It's a forlorn hope to think that, you know, you can regulate how words are used in common parlance. But because if you have an understanding of where it actually came from, I think it gives a very interesting perspective on its introduction into photography. And I'll explain what I mean by that over time. So I'm going to give you a kind of brief history of this, the emergence of this uniquely English idea, by the way. I mean, when you see it properly, it's an English aesthetic. It's not even a generally European one. It's English. And how it arose and how it developed and diffused across the arts in the second half of the 18th century leading into the early 19th century. So here we go. And it's a kind of 3 or 4 step process. Step 1, the inception of the idea of the picturesque, it actually starts off as a literary trope in travel writing. It's a way of talking about natural landscape as though you were talking about a painting. Typically, but a particular kind of painting, particularly the classical paintings of the Franco-Italian school. Am I still plugged in? So, yeah. So the artists I have in mind here are Claude Lorraine, the French master, 17th century master, who made his career mostly painting from Rome, or the Italian artist Salvatore Rosa, or the Dutch artists. So the beginning of the picturesque is about English noblemen going on their grand tour, viewing some splendid Italian landscape and saying, it's as though it was painted by Claude Lorraine. That's the beginning of it, you know. Or it's so wild and rugged it would require a Dutch master to convey this landscape. That's how it starts. And so in about the 1760s. And then actually, if I could have, but the next one actually, I'm gonna come back to that. I got these in the wrong. So it's then a small intellectual step, but actually a huge step on the ground to say, let's just flip this around and let's make artificial landscapes to look like paintings. So it becomes a form of landscape gardening. The idea, you know, this nobleman, he's got home, he's got a grand estate, and he gets, first of all, Capability Brown, and at a later point, Humphrey Repton, to dredge a lake, you know, to turn the stream or a puddle into a gigantic lake by, you know, excavating things. And the earth you scoop out when you're excavating, you make a great embankment with. And he went up with this. This is Stour Head, one of the most famous picturesque gardens in England. It's in Wiltshire. everything you see is artificial. This is not a natural landscape, it's a made landscape, and it's been made to look like a painting by Claude Lorraine. So it's an extraordinary thing to have done. And this then becomes the fashionable style of English landscape gardening. There's nothing formal about it, you notice. It's a very kind of, I mean, it's artificial. It's meant to look kind of faux natural, if you see what I mean. That's the point of the picturesque, is it's not formal, it's natural, except that it's not natural, it's artificial. I mean, the meaning of the word natural slips. So from travel writing, and it moves into different genres, but it never leaves one completely. It remains a feature of travel writing. It's moved into landscape gardening. It's going to move into painting and into architecture itself. And in painting and architecture, it has the same very, very specific values, which I now want to focus on. But all of these things also become interconnected and interlinked and self-referential. What are the values when you talk about picturesque architecture or picturesque painting? What are the values? Chiefly, the crucial ones are irregularity, asymmetry, and in Gilpin's terms, roughness. So there are two contexts to this. Why? Why those? I mean, you can see they're similar sorts of ideas: irregularity, asymmetry, roughness. Why those things? Well, we're coming out of essentially a classical tradition. Claude Lorraine was a classical painter, but it's attacking the classical tradition at its very core. It's turning the core value of any classical tradition. The core value is going to be order, which is best expressed by symmetry. So if you flip that and you turn it into asymmetry, you're undermining the core value within the system, as it were. You're not choosing a different system, you're working within the system, but you're subverting it. So that's one thing. But the other, for a theorist like William Gilpin, he's also got in mind a particularly influential essay by the 18th century English philosopher Edmund Burke. Now, any of you who've read Burke, you might know him much better as a political philosopher, but in his youth, he wrote a brief essay. You can imagine him writing it one Sunday afternoon, actually, called On the Origin of Our Ideas of the Sublime and the Beautiful. And this becomes hugely influential. He's trying to explain why we think things are beautiful. And he has one very simple idea. It's almost funny, it's so simple. To be beautiful, a thing has to be smooth. And if it's smooth, it's beautiful. It's as simple as that. There are hilarious passages in this essay where he's talking in one breath about polished furniture and the next about women's limbs, arms and legs, as if they're just a sort of continuum of kind of objects that are beautiful in exactly the same kind of a way. But as I say, important, influential essay. Gilpin takes that. What Gilpin is trying to do is he's trying to say, actually, Burke is talking about the sublime and the beautiful, but I'm interested in a third category of aesthetic objects called the picturesque. I need a criterion to define it. And so he just simply inverts Burke's, and instead of it's smooth, it's rough. So anything rough is picturesque. And if it's not rough, then it's not picturesque and it's not suitable for painting. Okay, I just want to give you a few quotes from him to drive this home. So this is, as I say, it's an aesthetic which is simultaneously developing in practice. So you think of the early English landscape painters. The landscape painters I've referred to so far are all foreign, because, of course, in the mid-18th century, your English nobleman, who's a patron, doesn't expect English artists to be doing landscape painting. You go to an Italian or a Frenchman or a Dutchman for that. You go to an English artist for a portrait. But English landscape painting does begin to arise in the mid-18th century. I mean, obviously, most famously with something like Gainsborough leading ahead and Richard Wilson. Towards the end of the century, you have Turner and Constable and all the very famous English landscape artists. But while that's going on, there are people busy theorizing about it as well. And the most important figure is William Gilpin. And at one point, he remarks this. He says, a piece of Palladian architecture. By Palladian, of course, he means neoclassical, as in derived from a big influence in 18th century English classical architecture was Palladio, the 16th century Italian. A piece of Palladian architecture may be elegant in the last degree. The proportion of its parts, the propriety of its ornaments, and the symmetry of the whole may be highly pleasing. But if we introduce it in a picture, it immediately becomes a formal object and ceases to please. Should we wish to give it picturesque beauty, we must use the mallet instead of the chisel. We must beat down one half of it, deface the other, and throw the mutilated members around in heaps. In short, from a smooth building, we must turn it into a rough ruin. No painter who had the choice of the two objects would hesitate a moment. So, having attacked the nobleman's grand mansion, knocked down half of it in order to make it picturesque, he then turns to said nobleman's country park, gets the same treatment. Turn the lawn into a piece of broken ground, plant rugged oaks instead of flowering shrubs, break the edges of the walk, give it the rudeness of a road, mark it with wheel tracks and scatter around a few stones and brushwood. In a word, instead of making the whole smooth, make it rough, and you make it also picturesque. You fit it for your picture. Okay, so can I go back to the previous? So this is actually a watercolor by Gilpin. And it's important to note that it's not a particular place. This is a kind of paradigmatic, picturesque view. And so it is sometimes unclear, as in the two passages I've just read you, whether he's talking about a painting or whether he's actually talking about a building and a park. But it's very clear in this case he's talking about painting. In landscape painting, smooth objects would produce no composition at all. In a mountain scene, what composition could arise from the corner of a smooth knoll coming forward on one side, intersected by a smooth knoll on the other, with a smooth plain perhaps in the middle, and a smooth mountain in the distance? The very idea is disgusting. You see how, fundamentalist he is. So this is your ideal kind of composition when there is not a single straight line, not a single smooth line, everything is rough. Okay, so the number of points I want to stress here. One is that this is an idea about creating landscape that is entirely artificial. It doesn't really even have very much to do with reality. It's to do with formal composition. And he's indeed, duly got his ruin and his rough forms here created by the foliage. But the second thing you might have noticed, and this is partly what kind of makes it slightly funny, is it has no morality. There's no politics in this. He's not interested in landscape from any agricultural or productive point of view. And this is the point, I think, that is germane to how it's used in India and how we interpret it. But it's very clear to me that is Gilpin's intention, and he's very explicit about it. So this is another bit of writing of his, which is of a dialogue upon the gardens at Stowe. It's a very early work by Gilpin. So Stowe is another country house with a very famous country park around it. And he imagines a conversation between two people about the garden. And one of them has a political conscience and is troubled. The other one is, representing Gilpin himself. But his interlocutor says, there is something so vastly picturesque and pleasing to the imagination in such objects as they're seeing, and they're a great addition to every landscape. And yet perhaps it would be hard to assign a reason why we are more taken with prospects of this ruinous kind than with views of plenty and prosperity in their greatest perfection. Benevolence and good nature, methinks, are more concerned in the latter kind. So all of this idea of, things thrown around in heaps, it doesn't work if what you want is productive land. And the character representing Gilpin answers, yes, but cannot you make a distinction between natural and moral beauties? Our social affections undoubtedly find their enjoyment and are most complete when they contemplate a country smiling in the midst of plenty, where houses are well built, plantations regular, and everything the most commodious and useful. But such regularity and exactness excites no manner of pleasure in the imagination. Thus a regular building perhaps gives us very little pleasure, and yet a fine rock, beautifully set off in chiaro obscuro, and garnished with flourishing bushes, ivy, and dead branches, may afford us a great deal. So, essentially what I'm arguing here is that you take comments like that, and we're dealing with an aesthetic which is entirely formalist. It's almost as though he's describing landscape or the components of landscape put together to make an abstract pattern. Now, I have to say, to be honest, there are not many writers on the picturesque in the 20th century and later who would go with me on this interpretation, because the impact of the whole kind of new art history of the 1970s, which kind of assumed a sublimated political agenda to any artifact, is not going to let anyone get away with an interpretation like that. And indeed, you could reasonably say that any declaration of being beyond politics is itself a political gesture. It tends to be typically a political gesture made by the right. It's a conservative, it's a reactionary stance to say, of course I'm not political. And the cynical critic would say, that's a political statement. And this is going to matter when we get to how it's understood in a different context, because I began with travel. Travel never goes away, and the picturesque comes to India. And what's it going to mean here when you're talking about mutilated members thrown around in heaps, and so on and so forth? That I will get to. But what I want to say is that when I wrote my own sort of theoretical treatise on the picturesque in India, it's a book called The Artificial Empire, I make the point that there's a distinction between how an aesthetic is formulated, what it's supposed to mean to its early practitioners and its theorists, and how it's consumed. You could perfectly reasonably have an aesthetic which is genuinely apolitical, amoral, not engaging with Virgilian matters of agriculture, but where it is understood on the ground by the people who are consuming it in a very different way. But for the purposes of the evening, since I know I've got a post-colonial critic on my left, I'm going to play devil's advocate and insist that the politicization of the picturesque misses a very remarkable point about it, which is that its an insistence on formal values takes the idea of landscape painting almost to the level of abstraction, which is an extraordinary thing to do. So here's my one example. If then you just flip on to, so there's next one. So here's William Hodges. Here's the first landscape painter doing it. So this is the Pask at Sakri Gully in Bengal. But you'll see how it is absolutely paradigmatically Gilpin. You know, he's avoided anything smooth. His knoll is not smooth, it's all bumpy. Everything in it is bumpy. He's got the rugged road, he's got the solitary peasant figure, he's got all of the cliches of Gilpin, and yet it's supposed to be topographical. So here's the paradox about travel and the picturesque, is you're traveling to find new places, but you already know what you want them to look like. You've got an ideal landscape already in your head. Why didn't you just sit at home and do it? And indeed, Alexander Cousins in the 18th century did exactly that. He made his landscapes from ink blots. It's like a sort of childish game. And he just squirted ink on a page and turned it into a landscape. A Bengali modernist that we highlighted just last year, Gopal Ghosh, did pretty much the same thing in a very different social context, much, much later. You know, you can just make a landscape out of your head. And if that's what you're going to do, why bother to travel? And indeed, I think that there's the problem of the picturesque in India, well, anywhere actually, wherever it goes, is there's a tension between this idea that you're going in search of the picturesque landscape, but actually you're taking it with you. And you're actually trying to make a real place conform to your pre-established ideal. So this is William Hodges, supposedly at the pass at Sakri Gully. He might just as well have stayed behind in Hampstead, for all that it actually conveys of that place. So the key elements then, and they're all here, are irregular forms of hills, broken stones in the foreground or a rough road, often a dark element in the foreground, a curved dark element in the foreground. That serves, that's not just because there was a dark bush there. Having a dark element in the foreground pushes your eye into the middle ground when you're looking at a picture. It's a straightforward formal device. Ruins, any building, if you're going to see a building, if it's not ruined, you look at it off-center. So just imagine you're looking at a building that's symmetrical, Taj Mahal, say. If you stand frontally, it's symmetrical. If you move to one side and then you project it onto a flat plane, you've lost the symmetry because of the angle. Okay, so you have, instead of having a regular shape, you suddenly have an irregular shape. If I move to the right, it gets bigger on the left. Yeah, I mean, it's because of the angles. So you're always going to be off-center. And if you're going to include figures, they should be solitary. Just one or two hanging around. Okay, so we move forward to photography. Can I have the next one? And when you look at these, it is very remarkable how all of those very artificial, formal elements that I've just enumerated appear in so many of these photographs. And you think, well, how could that be? Because Hodges is actually drawing it. If he wants to put broken stones in the foreground, he just has to draw them in. But this is a photograph. It's supposedly the pencil of light. What is it? Pencil of light, nature's subtle pencil. So that there's, it's an automatic image. There's no human interference at all. Okay, well, how naive is that? Because obviously, I'm not suggesting here that this is Biggs at the so-called Durga temple at Aiholi. It's not that he's actually kind of picked up boulders and thrown them in front. I mean, it's not that literal a following of Gilpin's prescription. Break it up and throw the mutilated members around in heaps. He's just chosen an angle of view where the broken stones of the foreground are very, very visible. The Durga temple at Aiholi is a symmetrical building, but he's not standing in front of it. He's standing to one side to make it look asymmetrical. I mean, everything about this image is picturesque, but it's the photograph. And what I'm suggesting is not that he's kind of got a manual. He's not carrying Gilpin with him. None of the artists did that. I mean, the relationship between theory and practice is obviously complex. I mean, Gilpin is not prescribing. He's looking at paintings as well as at landscape and describing things. The artists are looking at each other. And what I'm suggesting here is that this is a photographer in the 1850s for whom the English aesthetic is so deeply embedded that he can't see any landscape in any other way. That's going to be how he's going to approach it. So this is Biggs. I'm just going to run through them, but interrupt me, then we'll get to yours.
It's great.
The next one is Pigu at the Vitala temple in Hampi. Similar sort of thing. Again, the actual axis of the building is here. Yeah. So he would be standing somewhere over here if he wanted to show you the building formally. But obviously it makes for a more varied composition if he's got this building on the left, which is higher, and then this sort of disaggregated stone chariot. Notice how that's all covered in vegetation too. That's brilliant. One of the other writers there is not Gilpin so much, but Richard Payne Knight is very concerned about how the architecture is a component part of landscape. Again, it's a very non-functional approach to architecture. I mentioned right at the beginning that the picturesque influences architecture. How? Well, it's about massing. It's about the form of the building. You stop building them symmetrically. You have an irregular massing. But if you're representing a regular building, then, as I say, you go off center. But Richard Payne Knight says that architecture is a mere component part of what you see. It's a part of landscape, so that when a building is half covered in shrubbery or creepers, then it's the relationship between architecture and the natural world is very explicit, and that appeals here. So the next is by Andrew Neil of the same temple, and again, he's come up much closer up front. But again, notice the oblique angle. Okay, I'm suggesting that the oblique angle is not just the light was good from here. This is what I want it to look like. I want it to do it obliquely so that it comes out irregular. Okay, I'm going to rush through a few more and then I'm going to hand over to next one. You're getting it now. Johnson and Henderson, a Shiva temple at Ambernath. Again, the tree. And these are coming out of a long, by now, well-established. I gave you one example of William Hodges. The Daniels are picturesque, but if you look at almost anybody in the early 19th century, look at views of temples of Rajasthan made by the artists working for James Todd. You get the similar kind of approach where instead of thinking, well, the tree wouldn't have been there, would it? So if we want to really represent the temple, we probably should, when you're drawing, you could take the tree out. They don't. They leave the tree in because it makes it picturesque. And the solitary figures here are a sab and an attendant, but performing exactly the same function as the peasants in a formal function as the peasants in a gilpin. Next one. Again, it's the same site by the same photographers. So here he is actually axially aligned, but it's working magnificently because of the presence of the tree. And you can be pretty sure he's made these people stand here in order to, they weren't just happened to be passing by. He needs them compositionally. Okay, and a very interesting character is Beatu, and I know that Sudeshna is particularly interested. The next one, particularly interested in Beatu. This man of Anglo-Greek ancestry here at the gateway to Akbar's tomb at Sikandra. You see, if I were taking, as an architectural historian, if I were taking a photograph of this, I would have tried to stand in a way that the tree did not interrupt the entrance. Yeah, Beatu makes no such effort. And then next. So this is, the same site, same photographer at the same site. This is so confused a composition that actually I was looking at this with people who in the context of studying Mughal architecture, and it took them about 10 minutes to work out which angle we're looking at it from. Exactly. Because it is actually the front of the building of the tomb, but it's not obvious that that's what it is, because he's deliberately chosen an angle where the ground looks rough in front of it, rather than the smooth approach that you actually get, a Burkean smooth paved approach. Not going to have that, going to go off into the shrubbery and take it from the side. Okay, there's one other value there that comes with him, and this is why Beatu is so interesting. On the face of it, okay, this is a view of the residency in Lucknow. And again, the formal variety of this, there's no vegetation here. This is post-siege. Post-1857 siege, but the formal variety of the ruins, except that these ruins are not just any ruins. These ruins do have very specific value to a British audience, because this is the site of one of the most notorious confrontations of the 1857 uprising. I don't think that anyone in Beatu's audience seeing this could fail to have a more emotional response to this image. And so those other associational values are creeping back in, as it were. I don't think I would make the case of this being a purely abstract design. I'm going to give you a few more examples and then stop, okay? Impi at the Qutb Minar. Again, all of the cliches are there, the broken stones in the foreground. It's not to say, I'm not suggesting they weren't there and he had to, introduce them in the way that Beatu famously put skeletons in front of the gateway of the Sikandarbag to give a sense of the horror of the massacre there. But so it's not that he's put them here, it's that he's chosen an angle of view in which they make his foreground for him. Next. This is so we get to Samuel Bourne, who you're going to talk about more.
I'll talk about the Poco Pomo business. Giles.
Okay, so this one's just sort of pure landscape. The next one is...
It's the shimmering water. I mean, this is where the picturesque comes in, right?
Yeah. Fatty Posikri. And I'm actually going to stop when I get to the next one, because the turn here is when the Indian photographers take it up. And again, we have actually this sort of similar turn in this argument as in the previous one, that the most successful picturesque landscape photographer of India was Laladin Dayal. So when people started writing about early photography in India, there was for a while there was a kind of debate about whether there was an essentially different eye between that of the British photographer and the Indian photographer. I don't think most of us now think that holds as an argument. Sometimes you just can't tell unless it's labelled. But the point is that just as in an earlier period, the Bengali artist Sita Ram completely assimilated the picturesque aesthetic in watercolour painting, so Laladin Dayal assimilates it completely in photography and makes a huge commercial success out of it. So what's happened to your post-colonial rabbit now? I think I'm going to leave it at that and hand it over to Sudeshna.
Okay, thank you for that. And I'm not going to be the postmodern, post-colonial person you think I'm going to do. I'm just going to substantiate a couple of things Giles said. And the most important thing, as he said, is that the picturesque was formal, the picturesque was non-political. And the picturesque actually had a very formalist aesthetic. It was created. And photography was supposed to be real. It wasn't formal. You just photographed what you saw. And photography was, of course, in the Indian context, it could have been political. I mean, you can think in terms of the politics of architectural surveys. But the stuff with the picturesque is that the picturesque actually does something in terms of photography, in terms of accuracy. And it also tidies up many conflicts in nature. But I'll begin with somebody who wrote, she's Lady Eastlake, Elizabeth Eastlake, who wrote a tract on photography in the London Quarterly Review in 1857. And she, in her time, it was criticized because she called photography, she talked about photography as photography was a woman. But Giles talked about the rough edges, and let me read out a little bit of it. And as she says, and you'll see the nature as well coming here. So she says, if the photograph in its early and imperfect scientific state was more consonant to our feelings of art, it is because, as far as it went, it was more true to our experience of nature. Mere broad light and shade, with the correctness of general forms and absence of all convention, which are the beautiful conditions of photography, will, when nothing further is attempted, give artistic pleasure of a very high kind. So you have nature coming up with the picturesque here in a very, very strange manner. And she says, thus, a face of rugged rock and the front of a carved and fretted building are alike treated with the perfection which no human skill can approach. And if asked to say what photography has hitherto best succeeded in rendering, we should point to everything near and rough, from the texture of the sea-worn shell, of the rusted armor and the Fuchsian jacket, to those glorious architectural pictures, which, whether in quality, tone, detail, or drawing, leave nothing to be desired, for everything for which art, so-called, has hitherto been the means but not the end. Photography is the allotted agent. Now, the thing with picturesque in the 19th century is that it brought in the debate about whether photography was art or science. And this debate just went on throughout. But as I think Rahab reminded everybody in the audience, photographers call themselves artist photographers. And they were either calotypist or whatever. One of them was Deen Dayal. And let Deen Dayal be. Because what the picturesque there is, and you see it, I mean, he was the master of the picturesque. Though the picturesque in photography, in Indian photography, one has to say this, was brought in by Samuel Bourne. Could I have the next slide? Now, Dayal, this is, yeah, we can jump that because actually, Deepali, we jumped that. we come here. So this is Dayal on Kailash Temple, Ellora, and Dayal called himself as an artist photographer, and there was a high regard for his work because of its consistent superior quality. This was the tone, the shading, the composition, and the light. He gave importance to technical details and ordered the largest of equipment and all his lenses from abroad, from UK. He also had remarkable skills at producing what is called as a layering effect. And Giles actually talked about the middle ground, the high ground, the picturesque. If you look at the imagery, there were certain areas of concentration. But Dayal could actually, through the use of angles, and this is a skill which he learned from draftsmanship, and I think most of you know, he studied in Roorkee, the Technical Institute. He was taught surveying and draftsmanship. He actually used the layering effect to remarkable, he did it with the brilliant uses of light. And his photographs, we see strong angles in the imagery, which sometimes illuminates the triangulation method which is used in the surveys. Also, he waited for the right lighting. He not only used reflective devices to throw light in a desired area, but he also selected different lengths of exposure for different elements within the picture. So this was really composed, which allowed for a deepening or lightening of the tones to produce a desired result. And the next slide, please. So what Dayal's pictures actually show is his skills at surveying. Now, surveying, as it was taught to them, it meant to document and measure a tract of land for making a map. The basic elements for a survey for a measurement was a baseline and some stations. And you can see with Dayal's photographs, most of them, generally there would be a track which is leading to a higher ground. And you can see that with the baseline which he has as a track there. And it gets a commanding viewpoint, which is that, what is it called? The Rumi Minar. I forget, because I have actually excavated in Daulatabad for 6 years. And I forget the name of the Minar. It's not the it's a Chuni Minar. I forget. We used to call it the Rumi Minar, no? Char Minar is Hyderabad. Chand Minar. Okay, that also doesn't seem a gel anyway. I mean, I'm talking, okay. But we can see the Minar, which goes up. And what was important for Dayal was both to get a commanding viewpoint and a bird's eye perspective. So the top of the fort stands as a station or a fixed point. It leads the viewer's eye to a picture plane. And Dayal translated some of the physical features in the landscape into devices to read distances. And you can actually, many of his photographs, including if we go back to the Kailash, you can actually, he allows the viewer to gauge the distance, let's go back to the earlier one, between the various the architectural elements. And he literally does it through his skills, I guess, of using the triangulation method in the camera. He also, we go back to the Daulatabad fort, he also always photographed from the opposite side of the baseline, showing the surveyor's process of taking measurements from all sides. So an important aspect of Dayal's work was that rarely were these images produced in isolation. Usually one finds a part of a sequence that reflected how Dayal moved around the site and documented something in a photographic form. And I'm saying this without showing any photographs of Sanchi, but you can actually see that. And which is where he employs his surveying skills to create a picturesque form, which some of the things which Giles explained right now, and uses this brilliantly for doing what is then called an archaeological photography of all the sides of the monument, kind of doing the total measurement, the total survey, the total documentation through his photographs. His photography, as we know, has always been collaborative. So we also know that he created series of handsome booklets for views with Henry Hardy Cole, and the Autotype Company printed each album for ₹5 each. So the point about the picturesque, and in photography is also, photography has always been a collaborative art, and you kind of see that with Dayal's photos. Dayal, of course, sold the Picturesque, and that's there upstairs. I mean, his albums he sold for 50 to 200 rupees. And we also know that his individual photographs, at some point, he was selling each for 12 annas. And then if people wanted more of the duplicates, they were for 10 annas. Now, that's a lot of money, but he made money by selling this Picturesque. We come to the next one. With Bourne, and you said this is the classic one. And I just want to read again here Bourne's description. So this was in 1866. Bourne goes for his trip, and I say trip, to the Himalayas. There has been a lot, as Giles said, that they went for these travels, but they carried an idea in their head. Our man, and he's been kind of, this is what has been said, he probably thought in terms of using the Himalayas and showing the Alps. So there is a lot of Bourne and talking about the Matterhorn and talking about mountains in Europe. But the Himalayas could not be tamed, and he wasn't very pleased about many of his photographs. But I just want to say something, I mean, just kind of give the brief itinerary of Bourne, because that is also the Picturesque, it's the tour. So he left Shimla in the company of Dr. J.R. Player on 3rd of July, 1866, traveled with him to the Spiti River, where they parted company. He then continued on the Manirang Pass and the junction of the Spiti and Sutlej River, and then returned to Sungam and Chini, having amassed 62 negatives. He spent some time photographing the Rogi Hills, which he had first visited in 1863, and after photographing the glacier at the source of the Buspa, which is this photograph, he journeyed onto the foot of the Gangotri Glacier, from where he photographed the Bhagirathi, one of the sources of the Ganges issuing from the mouth of the ice cave. Now, Bourne's narrative, which is there in the British Journal of Photography, it provides an example of what Crispini would say, the techno-material complexity of photography in terms of the logistics of large and ambitious ventures, constraints and complexities of marshalling apparatus, chemical, human subjects in challenging climates and in diminishing times, because the light went out when by the time they'd set up the apparatus, the sun's rays were doing things which they didn't like. They also tell us his narratives about the endless marches with huge teams of coolies, and I quote him, retinues of 30 coolies carrying cameras, chemicals, tents, beddings, provisions. Everything has to be carried on the backs of the coolies. It was therefore necessary, can I quote him, that the packages should be as far as possible, small and light, so as to form only one man's load. Now, the coolies here are the visual pointers in the image you see. They're just the visual pointers. They appear as little more than dots in the landscape. The aesthetic appeal of the photograph obfuscates the rather crucial fact that the coolies would have stood on the glacier slopes amidst the snow and freezing winds for a considerable amount of time for the photograph to be composed. Bourne literally made his reputation as the master of the picturesque, quite literally on the backs of coolies, who also did not like, and as he said, being puckroed for his expeditions. And many of his writings talk about going to the villages, and the villagers literally begging not to take all the wheat from the field because he needed to feed his coolies. There are also descriptions of him beating his coolies with lathis so that they would walk on with him. So in a way, this is where perhaps the colonialist thing comes up in the picturesque. And one, as Crispini says brilliantly, that behind the picturesque, you actually hear the footsteps of the coolies, the drudgery, the trudging of the feet. The next slide, please. But the Indians, as Giles also said, as Deen Dayal shows, they literally picked up the picturesque. And the Ghats of Banaras is a brilliant kind of something to think about, because the picturesque also created the look of a city. And this is the booklet which is displayed upstairs. We do not know who's photographed it, but perhaps an Indian photographer. And I just quote from a description of the Banaras, from somebody who is anonymous. The article says, where to go with the camera. This article was written in 1893. And I would think that this booklet is probably produced in the 1880s. and I quote, "From the railway station to the Jagannath Ghat on the south, the city stretches crescent-shaped along the banks of the Ganges over 3 miles. Every inch of this length is picturesque. Do what you will, expose on what you may, you're certain to obtain pictures that will find honored places in any exhibition." So of course the picturesque is to show exhibitions, it is to sell. But the photographer is also asked to take his views from a bajro. A bajro is a boat on the Banaras. And the photographic panorama of the Ghats, which had many precursors in the pen and ink drawings. So William Hodges takes photographs of that. There is Henry Salt, who takes pictures like that. The Daniels take paintings like that. So what one could see is that they this kind of a photograph, it hones in on the ideal, in the words of one 19th century, mid-19th century Briton, and I quote him, of a splendid and opulent commercial town whose interior fell far short of what the picturesque beauty of its waterfront appearance seems to promise. The interior is, of course, narrow gullies. So the picturesque conveys the realist probe into the idealized sacred space that got constituted for Banaras by the mid-19th century. The imagery tidied contrasting residues of culture and nature and facilitated the visual conveyance of physically absent, conflicting phenomenon in juxtaposition, such as purity and pollution, life and death. That's what the Ghats are. Its holding power, of the picturesque holding power, is apparent in its long continuity in an ethnographic film, which was actually made in 1984, 1985 by Robert Gardner. It's called The Forest of Bliss. And if you haven't seen it, it's available on computer, as I say, because one can kind of Google it. The next slide. And then the picturesque comes with Narayan Virkar, who completely subverts it. And can I have the next slide? Because you see it here with the Ganga Sagar, the lake, and you see the same shimmering water. So Virkar, what he presents, let's go back to the slide before, he presents an indomitable Deccan plateau, illustrating the sheer force of the Maratha architecture, and also Shivaji's eternal power. It's indestructible amidst the ruins, commanding the magnificent picturesque domain. Now, the Raigarh fort was declared a protected monument in March 1909. In 1895, Abhaji Khare, who was a member of the Legislative Assembly, he started a fund for the restoration of Shivaji's tomb, which is inside this fort, and secured support from the government towards the project. The government promised rupees 5,000 towards the cost of repairing the Ganga Sagar. And you see the Ganga Sagar in the next slide. And the government also promised to erect a protective chhatri over what I would now say Shivaji Samadhi. The Britishers would call it the tomb, on condition that the design for the chhatri be submitted for approval. Khare, and it seems the others, had apparently failed to submit the design, upon which the government decided to place the tomb under the Preservation Act of 1904 as a way of keeping, and I quote, the cult of Shivaji at abeyance. Now, this was all reported in 1911 in the Proceedings of the Education Department in their Archaeology and Epigraphy section, titled Preservation of Shivaji's Tomb. And this is 1911, where the government says that the government does not now think it advisable to encourage any movement calculated to receive the objectionable cult of Shivaji, which is at abeyance at present, but will take necessary steps under Act 7 of 1904 to preserve the tomb. So the picturesque does all kinds of work, archaeological, preservation, conservation, etc. But with Virkar, we actually come back to Beato, because Beato and Linear Stripe, they all tried to create a visual memory. Linear Stripe, they both tried to create a visual memory of certain key events of colonialism. Virkar does the same thing, and they tried to create these key events of pre-photographic era. Virkar does the same thing. He creates a key event of Shivaji's grandeur amongst the ruins in a pre-photographic era through the picturesque. And I just stop here. So let's just hope this is not post-colonial for you.